Welcome to Sleepy Shadows, where history lingers in the corners of the night, and the stories we tell are as haunting as they are true. Tonight, you're invited to drift slowly through the shadows of a forgotten time, where superstition reigned and the dead were not always allowed to rest. As you settle into bed, allow your thoughts to soften, your breathing to slow, and your mind to wander gently through the candlelit corridors of the 18th century. In Eastern Europe, far from the bustling cities of Paris or Vienna, a quiet panic was growing. The air was heavy with uncertainty. Plague and pestilence ravaged small villages, crops failed, children disappeared into sickness, and sometimes, just sometimes, the dead were said to rise from their graves. They called them Apirs. Later, vampires. This was not fiction. These were real fears, real testimonies, and real corpses. Tonight, we explore the true stories behind the vampire panic of the 1700s, a time when entire communities lived in fear of the undead, where torchlight flickered across graveyards and silence never meant safety. We begin with the world that gave birth to the myth. Let us drift first to the heart of the Balkans, a land of dense forests, craggy mountains, and winding rivers choked with mist. It is the early 1700s. The world is changing. But here, in Eastern Europe, time moves more slowly. Villages are small, remote, and deeply rooted in tradition. The people till the soil, herd their animals, and live in modest wooden homes with thatched roofs. Life is hard, and the shadows seem to stretch just a little longer here. Death is a constant companion. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and the lingering echoes of plague sweep through these isolated towns without warning. A simple cough can become a death sentence. A fever might take a child in the night. In this world, medicine is not yet trusted, and often not available. Illness is not understood in the way we understand it now. The causes of death are mysterious, and so, the mind wanders, and in this wandering, folklore finds fertile soil. The line between the living and the dead is not so clearly drawn. When a person dies unexpectedly, when they waste away despite no obvious wound, questions arise. Had they been cursed? Had someone taken their life from beyond the grave? You see, in these rural communities, stories are more than stories. They are truth, passed down like heirlooms. In Serbia, Wallachia, and across Slavic lands, people speak in hushed tones of the Upir, a creature of the night, once a man, now returned to feed upon the living, and the villagers believe. Oh yes, they believe. They believe not in shadows, but in what they can see. The sick growing sicker after attending a funeral, a family perishing one by one after burying their patriarch, a bloated corpse, mouth stained dark red, dug up from the earth and looking too well fed for someone long dead. These are not tales told to frighten children, they are community warnings, cautionary truths passed between neighbours with lowered voices and nervous glances toward the graveyard. In this world, burial is not the end. Not necessarily. Let us imagine for a moment the atmosphere of such a night. The sun has long since dipped below the horizon. A thick fog curls low along the fields. In the distance a dog howls, a long, mournful cry. In a cottage lit by a single candle, a family sits silently. One chair remains empty, its occupant recently buried just 3 nights ago. But now, the child is sick, pale, fevered, muttering in their sleep. The mother says she saw something, someone, outside the window the night before. It looked like her dead husband, but that is impossible, isn't it? And so, the fear sets in. A quiet, creeping terror. Not the loud kind of fear that makes one scream or run. This is a quieter kind. The kind that knots the stomach and dries the mouth. The kind that leads people, whole communities, to dig up the dead. In many villages, these acts became ritual, desperate, ancient rituals, and always it begins with suspicion, a neighbour, a family member, a newly deceased stranger whose death coincided a little too closely with someone else's illness. You see, the vampire is not the charismatic figure of modern fiction. In 18th century Eastern Europe, the vampire was bloated, red-faced, reeking. Lying in a grave with blood at the mouth, it was the returned corpse, unsettled, hungry, and vengeful. The connection between disease and the dead was instinctual. They saw it in patterns, in the timing of illness, in dreams, in sounds at night. But it wasn't just whispers and fear. There were cases, real events, real people, real reports that survive to this day. And soon we will meet one of them, a man named Peter Plogojowitz. But before we open his grave, let's linger just a little longer here, in the hush of the countryside. In these remote places the graves are shallow, wooden crosses lean at crooked angles. The earth is soft and often wet. The smell of damp soil lingers in the air, heavy and cloying. You might hear, if you stay long enough, the soft settling of the soil and wonder what lies beneath. Because in the minds of those who lived here, in the grip of disease and mystery, death was not final. And the night was never empty. Let us drift now deeper into the roots of belief, past the graveyards and into the older places where words were whispered long before they were written, where fires crackled beside worn stone hearths, and the oldest stories lived not in books, but in breath, passed between generations, long before the vampire wore a cape, or charmed with aristocratic elegance. It wore the face of the familiar, of the neighbour, the cousin, the lover, the mother, the face of someone known, but changed. The Slavic peoples, those living across what is now Serbia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria and beyond, believed deeply in the permeability of death. For them, the world of the dead was not sealed off. It breathed alongside the living, invisible but present. And in times of misfortune, plague, drought, famine, or personal loss, the dead were often blamed. The word vampire, as we know it, is not original to English. Its oldest cousins, upir in Russian, upir in Ukrainian, vampirs in Polish, trace back to early Slavic languages. The precise origin is debated, but the meaning remains: something undead, something wrong. In Slavic folklore, an upir was not merely a spirit nor simply a restless ghost. It was physical, embodied, tangible, a corpse that rose from its grave seeking the blood or life force of the living. But how did one become an upir? That, dear listener, was the true source of dread. Because the path to undeath was treacherously easy. A person might rise as a vampire if they died an unnatural or violent death. They were excommunicated or unbaptized. They lived an immoral life or committed grave sins. They were a witch or consorted with spirits. They were the child of parents who broke certain taboos, such as incest or improper burial rituals, and sometimes tragically they were simply unlucky. Even animals could become vampires according to these beliefs. A cat jumping over a corpse, for instance, could render the dead unclean, marking them for an unnatural return. So great was this fear that in some regions cats were banned from entering a house during wakes. Mirrors were covered. The corpse's mouth was filled with stones or garlic, and coins were placed over the eyes, not just to pay the ferryman of the underworld, but to weigh the gaze of the dead shut. In the dark earth, it was said, an upir would wake slowly. At first it might stir in dreams. The living would report nightmares, visitations from the recently dead. Then came signs. Livestock would sicken, milk would sour, infants would cry endlessly, and shadows would shift where they should not. But if the community ignored these warnings, the vampire might rise fully. At night it would stalk quietly, not with great fanfare, but subtly. A cold breeze across the face, a door creaking that had been latched, a loved one falling ill, drained, pale, and silent. The upir was not glamorous. It did not sparkle or seduce. It clung to its hunger, dull and ancient. In this version of the myth, the vampire's true terror came not from its powers, but from its closeness, because it was one of them. A beloved husband, now twisted. A daughter, buried improperly. A neighbour whose eyes had once been kind, now glassy and cruel. There were tales, so many tales, of upirs being dug up and found bloated, ruddy-faced, their nails grown long, their shrouds blood-stained. People believed these were signs of activity, of feeding, and so preventative measures became tradition. Graves were dug deep and lined with thorns. Stakes were placed in the earth. Bodies were buried face down, so if they awakened, they would dig downward, not upward. Some communities left offerings at the graves, coins, bread, small trinkets, in hopes of appeasing whatever might stir below. and for those most feared, other, darker measures were taken. We will speak of those rituals soon, when we arrive at the gravesite of Peter Plogojowitz. But for now, reflect on this. In a world where science had not yet spoken, where death came swiftly and without explanation, and where each loss echoed with the fear of another to come, what else could the villagers believe? They needed reasons, they needed patterns, they needed to understand why tragedy struck again and again. And so the figure of the vampire, cruel, familiar and feared, took root, not as a monster from imagination, but as a horrifying reality that slept beneath the ground. As we continue, we'll explore how disease and fear worked hand in hand, and how the vampire myth became a comfort of sorts, offering answers, however terrifying, to the mysteries of mortality. The soil is still soft, the night is still long, and we are just beginning. Let us now drift gently into the quiet terror that haunted the breath of every living soul in 18th century Eastern Europe. The kind of fear that does not come from monsters alone, but from the things we cannot see, from slow fevers, from sudden deaths, from the unknown, disease. It moved invisibly through the streets, through straw-covered homes, through the very air itself. It took the young and the old, the innocent and the strong, and in the absence of knowledge, explanations were often found not in science, but in myth. In this atmosphere of dread, the vampire did not begin as a fantasy. It was a reason, a name given to an illness that could not otherwise be explained. Let us walk, slowly, through a village touched by plague. The year is 1725. The soil is dark with rain, and the sky hangs low like wool soaked with shadow. In the village square, no one lingers. Doors are shut, windows shuttered. Inside, a mother rocks her child, burning with fever. A father stares toward the bed where his wife lies pale and still. It had begun, perhaps, with a single death. A man who collapsed while working in the field. No warning, no pain, just gone. Then came the others, a woman who coughed up blood, a girl whose lips turned blue as her limbs trembled, and then the children. Always the children. Was it a curse? Had something been awoken? For those without physicians, without the language of germs or infection, there were only two truths: that the dead had gone into the ground, and that the living were following them. The conclusion, whispered among frightened lips, was simple. The dead were taking the living with them. This belief was not madness, it was grief wrapped in logic. For every plague outbreak there was a pattern. One died, and soon the rest followed. Sometimes in the same family, sometimes in the same house. This is what made the vampire seem so real, so reasonable. Who else could be responsible but the one who died first? Thus, the first victim became the first suspect. If a man died suddenly, and within days his wife and children fell ill, there were no coincidences. The villagers would wait, watching the gravesite, listening at night for footsteps where there should be none. And if the deaths continued, they would dig. What they found in those shallow graves only fed the fear, because corpses do not decay in perfect order. A body buried in winter may stay preserved longer than expected. The skin may blacken, the abdomen swell with gas, the mouth loosen and ooze with blood-like fluids. To us, these are the predictable signs of decomposition. But to those watching in the flicker of torchlight, with mourning still heavy in their hearts, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like proof. Proof that the dead had fed, that the Upia had returned, with lips still slick from the warmth of its latest victim. And in a world without antiseptics or microscopes, without an understanding of contagion, the vampire explained what no one else could. How death could spread silently from one to another. The rituals that followed were not born of cruelty, but of desperate hope. Hope that if the right measures were taken, if the corpse was staked, or burned, or beheaded, the dying would stop. Hope that they might hold on to the few loved ones who remained. In some cases, these rituals did seem to work. If a body was exhumed and destroyed and no one else died in the days that followed, the villagers took it as confirmation. The Upia had been destroyed. The threat was over. But of course, this was merely coincidence. Most illnesses ran their course. Most plagues burned out. But the mind, in its desperate yearning for cause and effect, saw patterns where there were none. And in the dark corners of barns and churches and family homes, belief hardened. Vampires were not stories to them. They were explanations. They were grief, made visible. They were sorrow, made solid. And so, the fear spread. Not just through villages, but through entire regions, across the Danube, up into the hills of Transylvania, down into the flatlands of Wallachia. The belief was carried by rumour, by caravan, by whispered prayer and graveyard tales. And as it moved, it took shape. The vampire became a shared vision. It became real not just because it was believed, but because communities made it real in their actions, their rituals, their exhumations and their terrors. It is no wonder then that the authorities eventually took notice, and soon, one particular case would rise above the rest. A name, now half buried by time but once spoken with fear, Peter Plogojowitz, a man who, in death, became more feared than he ever was in life, and whose grave, when opened, revealed horrors that would echo across Europe. But we will get to him in due time. For now, breathe gently and rest in the knowledge that fear, though quiet, shapes history just as much as war or kings. It seeps in slowly, unseen, like disease, and sometimes it digs up the dead. Now let us journey into the heart of a real case, one not drawn from rumour or whispered fireside tales, but documented, recorded, and sent to imperial authorities. A case so disturbing, so convincing, that it spread vampire panic across the Balkans and far beyond. The year is 1725, the place, a quiet Serbian village called Kisilova, a settlement nestled along the edges of the Habsburg Empire. This was the frontier, a place between worlds, between east and west, life and death, belief and reason. Here lived a man named Peter Plogojowitz, or rather, here he had died. Peter was, by all accounts, an ordinary peasant. There was nothing particularly noteworthy about him in life. He worked the land, lived modestly, and, when the time came, passed away without fanfare, after a short illness, and without any scandal. He was buried in the village cemetery, in a grave dug by neighbours, marked in the usual way. The rites were said, the community mourned. But then, something strange happened. Within 8 days of Peter's burial, 9 other villagers died suddenly. 9. All within the same small community. And not just from vague illness. These people died with striking similarities. They claimed, with fading breath, that Peter had come to them in the night, that he stood at the foot of their beds, that he leaned over them, silently, that he pressed on their chests, and then they grew pale, weak, and within days they too were gone. At first the stories might have been dismissed. After all, grief makes the mind vulnerable to suggestion. But the pattern was undeniable. Each person died shortly after claiming to see Peter. Each death sent the village further into fear. It became too much to ignore. The villagers, gripped by panic, turned to their local authorities, specifically to the Austrian military stationed in the region. This was, after all, an imperial province, and the state was watching. A military officer named Ernst Frombald was dispatched to Kisilova. His mission: investigate the bizarre and increasingly alarming reports. Frombald was not a peasant. He was educated, trained, and sceptical. But even he, upon arrival, found the fear palpable. The villagers met him with desperation. They pleaded with him to allow the exhumation of Peter's body. They were certain he was not truly dead. They believed he was walking the earth at night, and unless something was done, more would die. Frombald hesitated. To dig up a corpse, without clear reason, violated both religious and legal norms, but the pressure mounted. Finally the priest, hesitant but swayed by the villagers' distress, agreed, and on the agreed day, under grey skies, the grave of Peter Plogojowitz was opened. Now imagine the scene, slowly. Men standing in a half-circle, wrapped in cloaks, breath visible in the chill air, a priest murmuring prayers, villagers clutching crosses and herbs, a shovel scraping against damp soil, and then the coffin. Frombald and the others peered inside. What they saw horrified them. Peter's body was not in the state they expected. Though buried for over a week, the corpse appeared undecomposed. His skin looked fresh, even pink. His hair and nails had grown, and most disturbingly, there was blood at his mouth, as if he had recently fed. According to Frombold's written report preserved in Imperial archives, he was in no way decayed, and his body was complete. He had blood in his mouth which had flowed from the eyes and ears. His hair and nails had grown. This, to those present, could only mean one thing. Peter had returned from the dead. He was a vampire. The villagers demanded immediate action, and so the ritual began. A stake was carved from hawthorn wood, a tree thought to repel evil. It was sharpened and thrust through Peter's chest. As the stake pierced him, witnesses claimed his mouth opened, a groan escaped, and blood gushed forth. They took this as a final, chilling confirmation. But they were not done. As was customary in vampire purging rituals, the villagers next burned the corpse, reducing it to ash. This was believed to purify the remains and end the creature's power permanently. Only then did the village breathe again. Frombold returned to his superiors and submitted his report. No exaggerations, no embellishments, just a calm, detailed account of what he saw and what was done. His report shocked the Empire, because this wasn't a legend. It was official documentation, and once it was known that vampire hysteria had led to a sanctioned exhumation and ritualistic destruction of a corpse, the panic spread. If it could happen in Kisilova, it could happen anywhere. Other villages began to report similar stories. Other graves were opened. Other corpses burned. But Peter Plogojowitz remained the first, the one whose name would echo through halls of government, through theological debates, through tavern whispers and church sermons alike. And to this day, his case remains one of the earliest and best documented instances of vampire panic in modern European history. We will soon follow this trail deeper, to the stories of eyewitnesses who claimed to see Peter walking the streets, to the minds of villagers who tried to sleep while wondering if the dead might knock at their door. But for now, let your breath soften, and picture the grave, finally silent, smoke curling into the sky, and the villagers walking home, quiet, relieved, and forever changed. Now let us step softly into the uneasy space between testimony and terror, where memory is shaped not just by what was seen, but by what was felt, by what was feared, by what was believed to be true. The villagers of Kisilova did not act on impulse alone. They did not dig up Peter Plogojowitz's grave because of a single strange death, or one idle rumour. They acted because they had seen him, or at least they believed they had. Their stories, told in candlelit rooms and trembling voices, became part of the official account sent to Vienna. And those stories, eerily consistent, bring us closer to understanding how real the fear of the undead truly was. Let us return to the night after Peter was buried. The sky was clear but cold. Frost clung to the grass. In one home, a widow claimed she awoke to a strange sound outside her door. Soft footsteps, not heavy, not loud, but unmistakably human. She crept toward the shutters and peeked out. There, just beyond the gate, she saw him. Peter. His face was pale but unmistakable. He stood motionless, staring, and then he moved slowly into the dark. She was certain it was him. The next day, she told the priest, but he cautioned her not to speak of it. Perhaps it had been a dream, a trick of the light. But more reports came. Another villager, an old man, said, Peter knocked on his door just before dawn. He didn't open it. He couldn't move. But he heard the voice, low, familiar, calling his name. The man refused to eat after that. He grew weak, and 3 days later, he was dead. Still more whispered accounts surfaced. A young boy claimed he saw Peter walking behind the churchyard, hands and mouth red, as if soaked in blood. He ran, and later developed a fever. He died by the week's end. A farmer's wife said she saw Peter enter her barn at night, then disappear. The cow gave no milk the next morning. The chickens refused to roost. Such stories sound fantastical to us now, tales better suited for fiction than history. But they were believed, and in truth, belief was everything. These accounts weren't only spoken aloud, they were recorded. In Frombold's report, he notes that multiple villagers independently claimed to see Peter alive after his death, that each death followed a sighting, and that each body bore no wounds, only a wasting sickness, as if life had been drained rather than taken by violence. To the villagers, this was not coincidence. It was a pattern, a dark, undeniable rhythm. They watch for signs, a figure glimpsed at dusk, a chill where there should be warmth, a sudden illness, unexplained. Each event reinforced the belief, and as belief grew stronger, so too did the visions. It is difficult to know, centuries later, what these people truly saw. Were they grieving? Was the trauma of death clouding their minds? Or had fear created a shared illusion, one that made the impossible seem real? Whatever the explanation, the fear was real, tangible, unshakable. So real, in fact, that entire households refused to sleep through the night. Some kept candles lit at all hours, others slept in shifts, with one member watching the door at all times. Some families placed garlic or hawthorn beneath pillows, sacred objects near the hearth. They did not sleep, because they believed the dead walked. These were not uneducated people, nor mad. They were simply human, caught in the great tide of mourning and uncertainty, living in a time when disease came swiftly and death made no sense. They needed reasons, and Peter, once a neighbour, now a spectre, became that reason. It's worth noting that this vampire was not seductive, or ancient, or powerful in the way modern stories suggest. Peter was not a count. He lived in a village. He walked with bare feet, and if he returned, he did so not in glory, but in grief. His name would become a legend. But for those who saw him, if they truly saw him, he was simply a man they buried, and were not allowed to forget. When we return, we will peer even deeper into this moment of horror, to the exhumation itself, to the strange rituals performed, to the moment when the truth was sought in the dirt. So now, let your breathing slow. Picture the quiet fields of Kisilova, the church bell silent, the villagers praying, or watching, or waiting, and the grave undisturbed for now, but not for long. Let us now open the grave, but gently, with care, not in haste, not in drama, but with the solemn weight of history and fear resting upon every breath. Because in the village of Kisilova, the whispers had become a roar. The people were no longer simply afraid, they were certain that Peter Plogojowitz was not resting peacefully, certain that he was not dead in the way the dead were meant to be, and so the villagers petitioned the Empire. Enter Ernst Frombald, an Austrian military commander stationed nearby, representing the imperial interests of the Habsburg monarchy. He was no superstitious peasant, no trembling priest. He was a man of order, discipline, and state authority. And yet, what he witnessed in Kisilova would find its way into official imperial records, not as folklore, but as fact. The villagers told him everything: the visitations, the deaths, the sightings of Peter walking near his own grave. Frombald hesitated. He was bound by law, by the church, by the Empire's preference for logic and control over old-world panic. But the people were relentless, and so, on a quiet morning, grey with mist and heavy with expectation, the investigation began. The burial ground was still. A patch of dirt, slightly sunken, marked the place where Peter had been laid to rest just 10 days earlier. A priest stood nearby, clutching his cross, eyes downcast. Frombald took notes. Villagers formed a circle, silent, holding tools, herbs, and crosses, passed down through generations. The air was cold, but still. No wind, no birdsong, just the sound of shovels slicing into earth. As the soil was removed layer by layer, a quiet dread settled over the gathering. They reached the coffin. Its lid was pried open, slowly, reverently, as if some part of them still hoped it would be empty. But it was not. There lay Peter Plogojowitz. Yet something was wrong. Horribly wrong. Frombald would later write with measured precision, though buried 10 days, the body was undecomposed. The hair, beard, and nails had grown. There was fresh skin beneath the old, and his mouth was stained with fresh blood. To the villagers, this was no surprise. It was confirmation. Peter's eyes, though closed, seemed too full. His skin, flushed and pinkish, seemed too alive. His belly was swollen, common in decomposition, yes, but misunderstood then as gluttony. And the blood at his lips, to them that was not decay, it was evidence of feeding. To the mind steeped in 18th century superstition, there could be no mistake. This was not natural. This was not right. Peter had returned from death, and he had fed on the living. Frombold, though careful with his words, did not dispute the villagers' account. In fact, he approved their request, and so the ritual began. They brought forth a stake, carved from hawthorn, a wood thought to ward off evil. It had been prepared for this purpose, sharpened, blessed. Peter's body was lifted slightly, his limbs stiff, his mouth slightly parted. With prayers murmured, the villagers drove the stake directly through his chest, and in that moment, witnessed by Frombold himself, they said, Peter groaned. A sound emerged, not a scream, not speech, but something wet and gurgling as the gases of decay released. The blood that spilled was dark and thick. To modern science this is known. To 18th century villagers, it was horrifying. They saw it as proof. Peter had been drinking the blood of the living. The stake remained. But still, that was not enough. To prevent his return entirely, the villagers took further steps. They removed the head, separating it from the body. They burned the remains down to ash, and the ashes were buried outside consecrated ground so that no evil might rise again. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning flesh and bone, but to the villagers it smelled like safety. And when it was over, they prayed. Some wept. Others watched the smoke trail into the sky, carrying with it, they hoped, the last breath of the nightmare. Frombold did not hide what he saw. He sent his full report to Vienna, describing everything. The villagers' panic, the signs on Peter's body, the exhumation, the stake, the burning. He did not offer judgment. He did not mock their beliefs. He simply wrote the truth as he saw it. That truth, calm, clinical and complete, was more terrifying than any tale, because it told the world that even the Empire, even its trained military men, even its priests, could not dismiss what had happened. Peter Plogojowitz had died, and yet somehow he had lived again. What followed was an epidemic of fear. Villages far beyond Kisilova began to report similar events. Other graves were opened, other corpses burned. The vampire panic had begun, and next we will trace how this panic, this strange fever of superstition, spread from Peter's grave outward, across hills, across borders, across the minds of a terrified people. But for now, let us return to silence, to the stillness after the flames, to the earth finally at peace, if only for a while. Let us now walk carefully into the rituals of old, into a world where belief, fear and custom wove themselves together, not merely as stories, but as practices, actions taken with trembling hands and desperate hearts. When the dead refused to stay dead, when illness and shadow fell across a village and the whisper of vampire stirred among the living, there were methods, rituals, ancient, grim, and deeply specific. These were not tales told for entertainment. They were instructions for survival, and whether or not they were ever truly needed, they were followed, with absolute devotion. Let us begin with the most iconic of all, the stake. The heart, across many cultures, is the seat of life. It pulses with blood. It gives rhythm to breath, to warmth, to will. To those who feared vampires, the heart was also the centre of evil, the place where undeath clung like rot. Thus, when a vampire was suspected, when a corpse appeared too intact, too lifelike, or too preserved, the first step in the ritual was to locate the heart and pierce it. The wood used for the stake mattered. Hawthorn was most common, its thorns and sacred symbolism tied to protection. In some places, ash, oak, or blackthorn were preferred. The stake was to be hand-carved, often blessed by a priest, and cut from a tree believed to repel evil. The villagers would gather. A grave would be opened under overcast skies or by the flicker of torches. The coffin lid creaked open, sometimes reluctantly, as if even the wood feared its contents. And the stake would be raised. Then, with a prayer or a cry, or sometimes only silence driven down through the heart, sometimes the body reacted. Gas escaping from the chest cavity could create sounds, groans, wheezes, even a sudden rush of air. The skin might rupture, the mouth open, blood might rise. Modern medicine understands this as natural decomposition, but to the people watching then, it was proof. Proof that the creature still lived, even in death. They would recoil, or cry, or whisper blessings through pale lips. But the ritual was not over. In many parts of Eastern Europe, staking alone was not enough. What if the vampire were to heal? What if it could pull the stake from its chest? To ensure the final death, the head was removed. Some communities believed the vampire's power lived not just in the heart, but in the eyes, the teeth, the tongue. To stop it from returning, the head had to be separated. Sometimes it was placed at the feet of the body, or between the legs. Other times it was burned entirely. In some cases, the mouth was filled with garlic or holy objects, stones, coins, or crucifixes. The idea was to clog the pathway between the body and the world of the living, to make speech, breath, or bite impossible. Some even sewed the lips shut. These were not acts of vengeance, they were acts of fear and love, because those in the grave were not strangers. They were brothers, daughters, friends, people once embraced, now feared. So the rituals were as much about grief as they were about protection. In the most serious cases, such as that of Peter Plogojowitz, the body was burned. This perhaps was the final step, the ultimate severing of the vampire's tie to the earth. Fire purifies, it consumes, and when nothing is left, there is nothing to rise. The body was laid on pyres of dried wood and herbs. Sometimes rosemary or sage was added to cleanse the air, and as the flames took hold, the villagers would pray. The smoke, black and pungent, was believed to carry the last remnants of evil into the sky, dispersing it, dissolving it. Ashes were gathered and buried outside church grounds, so the soul could not taint holy places. Sometimes the ashes were scattered into rivers, other times mixed with wine and consumed as protection against further plague. Yes, even that. These rituals seem gruesome now, and they were, but they came from a place of longing, of not understanding, of trying to understand. They were the last defense against the inexplicable. In Romania, similar rituals were performed, often in the dead of night by family members. In Bulgaria, suspected vampires might be pierced through the navel or dismembered entirely. In Greece, some burned bodies while dancing around the fire with bells to confuse the spirit and prevent it from returning. Across the Balkans, each community had its own rules, its own mix of pagan belief and Christian influence. But the message was the same. The dead must stay dead, and if they rise, they must be stopped. These practices were more than superstition. They were cultural responses to real pain, to epidemics that killed silently, to wars that left bodies unburied, to winters that starved whole families. They were a way of making meaning, however dark, in a world that often made none. And though the Enlightenment was dawning, and science beginning to whisper its truths, for most villages ritual still held the louder voice, and so grave after grave was opened, stake after stake carved, ash after ash scattered, because even if vampires weren't real, fear was. When we return, we will see what happened next, how the fire spread from Kisilova across the Balkans, how other villages caught the panic, how vampire fever gripped an entire region. But for now, let the flames burn low in your mind, the smoke curl quietly upward, and the silence of the grave settle once more. Let us now drift seamlessly from the rituals performed in fear to the way that fear spread, like wind carrying embers from a fire long thought extinguished. Though the ashes of Peter Plogojowitz had cooled in the soil of Kisilova, his story did not rest. It travelled. On the tongues of soldiers and traders, of priests and magistrates, it moved swiftly across borders, and with it a ripple of panic, gentle at first, like a breeze brushing across still water, then faster, louder, rising into something that could no longer be ignored. The vampire panic had begun. What had started as a single grave, opened under the grey skies of rural Serbia, soon became a regional phenomenon, one that would stir the fears of villagers, alarm imperial authorities, and even draw the gaze of Enlightenment scholars across Europe. Let us follow that path now, quietly, carefully. The Balkans in the early 18th century were a tapestry of empires, cultures, and tensions. Here, in the shadows of great powers, the Habsburgs to the west, the Ottomans to the east, lay a fragile landscape of rural villages and ancient traditions. superstition ran deep. So when tales of Peter's return from the grave reached neighbouring communities, they did not meet disbelief, they met recognition. In village after village, old suspicions were awakened. That uncle whose corpse hadn't decayed properly, that neighbour whose death was followed too closely by the death of others, that dream of a cold hand at night, or a whisper behind the door. People began to look differently at their dead. Fresh graves were no longer final, and any sudden death, any unexplained illness, might mean a vampire was among them. Soon, across Serbia, Wallachia and Hungary, graves were opened in droves. Records from the time, yes, official records, speak of villagers staking corpses believed to be restless, priests reluctantly blessing rituals once denounced as pagan, military officers attending burnings, not with ridicule, but with solemn observance. Even as the Enlightenment dawned across Europe, with its reason and rationality, the rural provinces remained rooted in older truths. In 1727, just 2 years after Plogojowitz, another wave of panic erupted in a Serbian village not far from Kisilova. There, a man named Arnold Paole would rise, at least in the imagination of his grieving neighbours, and spread fear anew. But we will speak of him soon. For now, let us stay with the tide as it spreads. In Hungary, several cases mirrored those in Serbia. Bodies bloated and ruddy, mouths stained with dark fluid. Villagers reporting visitations, the feeling of being watched, of being touched as they slept. The same sequence repeated: fear, exhumation, staking, decapitation, burning. In Transylvania, even the whisper of vampirism could lead to panic. There, where the mountains cast long shadows and folklore ran deep, the vampire became not just a fear, but an identity, a name, a face. And though the image we now associate with the vampire, the cape, the castle, the immortal seducer, was still far off in literary future, the core fear had taken root, that death was not the end, that something might crawl back from the soil to take you next. As reports mounted, the Habsburg authorities grew uneasy. What began as isolated rural superstitions had turned into a widespread phenomenon, a cultural contagion of sorts. Some officials began compiling reports. They documented each incident with meticulous detail, the condition of the corpse, the testimony of witnesses, the rituals performed. They did not always intervene. Sometimes they approved the exhumations outright, believing it would quell panic and prevent social unrest. To them, these were not religious matters. They were matters of public health, order, and imperial stability. But to the villagers, it was survival, and as the tales grew bolder, the stories more vivid, the panic deeper, other villagers began to prepare for the possibility that their own dead might not stay buried. They set watches over cemeteries. They avoided passing near fresh graves after sunset. They carried charms, crosses, garlic and iron, worn close to the skin. Some even began placing stones in the mouths of the dead, or driving iron nails through the temples of the deceased. Preventative measures, they called them. The vampire had become not only a creature of nightmare, but a public concern. What we see in this moment of history is something more than just myth. We see a society attempting to explain the unexplainable, to find meaning in illness, in mourning, in sudden death. We see fear taking shape as ritual. We see belief spreading like fire, not because it was logical, but because it brought comfort. Even terror can be a kind of control. If you know what to fear, you can know how to act. So the panic moved, village to village, grave to grave. And though it began with Peter Plogojowitz, he was only the first spark. Others would follow, and soon another name would emerge from the pages of dusty reports. A man who died too suddenly, whose shadow loomed too long, whose grave, like Peter's, would not stay closed. Arnold Paole. But let us pause here. Let the flames of fear flicker and settle. Let the ground close again, for now, and breathe deeply, knowing that history, even in its darkness, has already passed, and that we walk now only among shadows. And so, as fear moved from one village to the next, carried not by wind but by whisper, one figure remained ever present in the shadowed margins of this panic: the church. In the flickering candlelight of small chapels and mountain shrines, in the silence between prayers, and in the chill of freshly dug graves, the church stood, uneasy, watching, uncertain. Not because it didn't believe in evil, but because it did. To understand the vampire panic of the 18th century, we must understand the fragile alliance between religion and folklore, between scripture and superstition. The church did not create the vampire, but when the vampire arrived, the church was called upon. To the faithful, death was not merely the end of breath. It was a sacred crossing, from this world into the next, a soul released from flesh, guided by divine hand toward peace or judgment. But the vampire disrupted this order. It was an in-between thing, neither alive nor dead, neither forgiven nor condemned. A soul that lingered, corrupted, or perhaps never passed on at all. And that unsettled not only the villagers, but the priests, because if the dead could walk, if a buried man could rise, feed, and return to the soil by dawn, then what did that mean for the promise of eternal rest? Was it punishment, demonic interference, a flaw in the rites, a sign of the apocalypse? Each explanation was more troubling than the last, and so the church was drawn into the panic, reluctantly, cautiously, but inevitably. Imagine a rural parish priest in 1725. He has few books, little money, a congregation terrified by something they do not understand, and now they are at his door pleading, "Let us open the grave, let us drive the stake, let us call on the old ways, Father, just this once." The priest resists. It goes against canon law. The soul must be left to rest. Tampering with the dead is sin. But what if the living are dying? Again and again we find reports of clergy who eventually consented, with deep reservations, to the exhumations. Not because they believed in vampires, but because they believed in fear. They understood that when belief consumes a village, it must be addressed. Even if that meant participating in ancient rites the church had once condemned as pagan. In some cases, the priest would agree to perform blessings before an exhumation, sprinkling holy water on the tools, reciting prayers over the coffin, even walking with the villagers into the cemetery, holding a cross aloft. When the stake was driven, the priest might utter Psalm 91, a scripture of protection, of shadows and wings, of deliverance from the terror of the night. When the corpse was burned, he might remain silent, or he might turn his face away, but still, he came, because in that moment the church was not merely officiating, it was witnessing. Far from the rural chapels in the cities of Europe, theologians debated these events with deep discomfort. Some believed the panic was an affront to faith, a return to ignorance, to heresy. They warned that digging up the dead disturbed the divine order, that fear of vampires was rooted in paganism, not Christianity. Others took a different view. They argued that if Satan could possess the living, why not the dead? Perhaps vampires were real, not as monsters but as tools of the devil, corrupting the body after death. Some even suggested that improper funerary rites, or the lack of a Christian burial, could leave the soul vulnerable to possession. In this way, the vampire became not only a physical threat, but a spiritual one. The line between science and superstition blurred, and so too did the church's position. Ultimately, the role of the church during the vampire panic was not to lead the hunt, but to stand beside it, to offer comfort where it could, to impose order where chaos threatened, and to try, however imperfectly, to hold the balance between ancient fear and eternal faith. Many priests buried the exhumed again after the rituals were done, this time with renewed prayers, deeper blessings. They hoped perhaps to cleanse what had been tainted, to soothe what had been stirred, and to remind the living that death, however terrifying, was still sacred. As the fire of panic spread, the church became not just a witness, but a mirror, reflecting the inner terror of a society caught between worlds, between life and death, between folklore and faith, between light and shadow. And now, as we turn gently to the next chapter of this haunting tale, we will meet those who did not wait for permission, those who took matters into their own hands, the vampire hunters. But for now, rest your thoughts in stillness. Picture a chapel bathed in moonlight, a priest at the altar, and the hush of prayers whispered over freshly turned soil. And so, from the flickering candlelight of the chapel, we now step into the cold fields beyond, where graves wait quietly, and some do not stay closed. Not every community waited for the church's blessing. Not every village relied on prayers alone. Some sent for hunters. They came with bundles of herbs, leather pouches of iron nails, and sharpened wooden stakes. Sometimes they arrived cloaked in silence, travellers by trade or by oath. Other times they were drawn from among the locals, blacksmiths, farmers, even former soldiers, men known for strong arms and stronger stomachs. But what defined a vampire hunter in the 18th century was not just their tools, it was their belief, their readiness to face death and what might lie beyond it. Let us meet them now, these forgotten figures of grim resolve, not with flair or fantasy, but with quiet truth, because they were very real, and the work they performed was often sanctioned by both fear and faith. Unlike the imagined vampire hunters of modern fiction, cloaked in mystery, armed with silver and secret knowledge, the real vampire hunters of the Balkans were practical, often local, and deeply embedded in the cultures that feared the dead most. Some were healers or folk doctors, skilled in the ways of herbs and protections. Others were ritual specialists, known for their ancestral knowledge of burial rites and superstitions. Many were simply experienced men, those who had seen a body rot, or had watched disease steal through a village, death by death. They did not hunt for glory, they hunted to stop the dying, and once the signs were there, once someone died too quickly, or too many people fell ill too fast, these men were summoned, not as heroes, but as a last resort. Their tools were not elaborate, but they were deeply symbolic. Stakes, of course, carved from sacred woods, hawthorn, ash, or oak, often personalised with marks or prayers. Knives for decapitation, plain, iron, heavy enough to sever with one clean strike. Cords to bind the limbs of corpses said to stir in the night. Garlic, wormwood and nettle, bound into satchels or laid on the chest of the dead to weigh down the spirit. Mirrors, sometimes placed over a grave to reflect the soul back to the earth. More than anything, they carried ritual. Because what the hunters knew, better than any scholar or soldier, was that the act mattered as much as the tool. It wasn't just about the stake or the fire, it was about doing it right, so that the villagers believed, so that fear would sleep again. Hunters often worked alongside local elders or priests, though not always with approval. They would enter a village after a call, usually following a cluster of mysterious deaths. The body would be exhumed under watchful eyes. Signs were checked. Was the corpse bloated as if full of stolen blood? Were the lips red, the cheeks too rosy, the nails too long? Did the eyes seem to move, or the limbs resist stillness? If so, the hunter would begin the rites, a stake through the heart, decapitation, clean and swift. In some cases, removal of the heart itself, burned separately on sacred ground. Ashes were sometimes buried in crossroads, or mixed with holy water and poured into a stream. Each action was deliberate, each motion done to satisfy both belief and tradition. Because if even one step was skipped, the fear would return, and with it, the panic. Vampire hunters were not celebrated. They were often feared themselves, touched as they were by the presence of the undead. Some lived alone, on the edges of their communities. Some were respected. Others were watched with suspicion. But they carried the weight of something larger than themselves. They bore the responsibility of being the barrier between the living and the return of the dead. And though many of their names have been lost, forgotten in the folds of local records or erased by time, their work was real. It was not theatre. It was not legend. It was the quiet work of fear management. Because when you cannot understand death, you try to control it, and the vampire hunter was one of the few willing to hold the line. What's striking as we reflect on these figures is how they existed in the space between the sacred and the superstitious. They were not priests, though they often worked beside them. They were not doctors, though they studied the body. They were not warriors, though they fought the most feared enemy of all, the unknown. They were in essence cultural healers, not curing bodies, but curing belief, restoring the psychic balance of a community by removing the physical object of its fear. So as we drift from their shadowed paths, let us leave them there, silent, unknown, but not forgotten, And let us continue deeper into this tapestry of panic and belief, to the very signs that would mark a vampire's presence in the first place. Because before the hunter came, there were always clues. Let us follow the quiet thread of fear that began long before the stake was carved, before the grave was opened, before the priest was summoned or the hunter arrived. Because every vampire panic began with a whisper, a glance, a sign. In the villages of Eastern Europe, nestled among misty hills, thick forests and winding rivers, there were signs that the dead had not rested as they should, signs that something sacred had been disturbed. They were not always obvious. Sometimes they came as dreams, as shadows at the edge of memory. A child waking with blue lips, a cow refusing to give milk, a body that did not decay. To understand how the vampire panic gained strength, we must understand the language of fear, the symbols that communities watched for, the strange and subtle marks that told them, this is not a natural death. Let us walk gently through those signs now, not to judge them, but to understand them. Long before science explained the process of decomposition, people interpreted what they saw with the eyes of folklore. A corpse was expected to behave in a particular way, to grow pale and shrink with time, to lose its moisture, to decay slowly but steadily. But sometimes when a grave was opened, often weeks after burial, something else was found. The villagers would gather round and whisper. The body was bloated as if it had been feeding. The skin, instead of turning grey and dry, appeared rosy. Blood was found at the mouth, around the nose, beneath the nails, and then there were the eyes, in rare cases glassy, wide open. The fingernails, instead of rotting, had grown longer, curling like claws. Even hair might seem to have grown, though we now know this is illusion. To them it was undeniable. The corpse had lived again. But it wasn't only the dead who gave away the vampire. It was the suffering of the living. When someone became ill without explanation, when no wound could be found, no cause named, it was said they had been visited. Symptoms varied: a pale and drained complexion, loss of appetite, sleep paralysis, feeling a weight pressing on the chest at night, nightmares of being chased or watched or kissed by cold lips. Some awoke with tiny bruises on their necks or wrists. Others claimed to feel their life being pulled from them in the dark. A string of such illnesses, especially among a single family, was often seen as a chain of vampiric attack. The villagers would whisper, who was the first to die? Whose grave lies freshest in the earth? Because that, they believed, was where it began. Not all signs were physical. Dreams played a vital role in how the vampire's presence was felt. If the dead appeared in dreams, especially asking for food or shelter, it was seen as a warning. If the dreamer felt embraced, or strangled, or bit during sleep, that was taken as proof. Some believed a cat jumping over a coffin could reanimate the dead. Others feared shadows cast in the wrong direction, or dogs howling at a particular door. All of these were omens, and when too many aligned, the grave was opened. In response to these fears, rituals began even before death. Sickbeds were surrounded by herbs, garlic, rue, juniper. Bells were tied to windows or animal skulls hung from trees to ward off evil. A cross might be laid at the feet of the dying to remind the soul where to go. If someone died violently, or unbaptized, or outside the bounds of the church, they were more likely to be seen as a candidate for vampirism. Such a person might be buried outside the village, at a crossroads, or with a stone in their mouth to prevent rising. Sometimes the corpse was stabbed before burial, just to be sure. These were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of desperation, of people trying to make peace with death. In these small communities, death was not distant. It lived next door, it lingered in the garden, it walked the halls. And so, watchfulness became tradition. Mothers checked on sleeping children every hour. Farmers crossed themselves before entering barns. Gravediggers buried the dead with care and with precautions, because even if only 1 in 100 corpses came back, that was still one too many. These signs, the bloated corpse, the mouth stained red, the dreams of cold lips, were more than symbols. They were codes, messages from a world the villagers did not fully understand, a language built from fear, grief, and memory. And once the signs appeared, action was taken. The rituals began, the hunter was summoned, and the story moved forward. As we move forward ourselves, we will meet another whose death brought fear, another whose name is etched into the dusty records of vampire lore. Arnold Paole, a soldier, a man of routine death, and then one more terrible story. But for now, let the signs fade from your mind, the grave still, the body at rest, and sleep begin to settle around you like dusk on ancient hills. Now we continue, softly, slowly, into the next chapter of this quiet nightmare, where another name rises from the soil of memory, where death does not end the tale, but begins it. In the records of the Habsburg military, neatly inked and preserved in fading script, there lies the name of a man, Arnold Paole, a soldier, a Serbian, ordinary in life, extraordinary in death. He did not seek to haunt. And yet his memory lingers like a breath in a cold room, because his case mirrored that of Peter Plogojowitz, and it too ignited fear that swept across villages, spilled into official channels, and drew attention from scholars far beyond the Balkans. This is the story of a man whose end was not an end. Arnold Paole had once served in the Austrian military. The early 1700s were a time of near-constant conflict in the region. Borderlands were tense with the long tug-of-war between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg crown. We know little of Arnold's youth, only that he survived campaigns, wounds, and foreign landscapes. But there is one detail from his service that would define the rest of his story. He claimed that while stationed in Greece he had been attacked by a vampire, not bitten, not killed, afflicted. And in fear, Arnold sought a remedy. According to local law, he found the vampire's grave, dug it up, consumed a portion of the soil in which it was buried, and rubbed his skin with the creature's blood. This, it was said, would break the curse. But whether it worked is another matter entirely. Years later, in the small village of Meduena, Arnold Paole settled into life as a civilian. He worked, he farmed, he lived without incident, until one day in 1726, he fell from a hay wagon and died of his injuries. It was sudden, painful, but nothing unnatural, at least not at first. He was buried in accordance with the local custom. The grave was marked, the rites performed, but then the whispers began. Villagers began to claim that Arnold had been seen walking at night. Livestock was found drained of blood. Children woke with unexplained bruises, and several locals began to fall ill, wasting away with no apparent cause. Some swore they saw Paole at the edge of their fields. Others claimed they heard his footsteps near their windows. 4 people died, and just as in Kisilova the townspeople turned toward the grave, they dug him up, and what they found chilled them. Arnold's body was not as they expected. It was plump, not wasted. Fresh blood stained his mouth. His nails and hair appeared to have grown. The wounds from his fall were healed. To them there could be no doubt. Arnold Paole had become a vampire. What followed was a scene nearly identical to the one in Peter Plogojowicz's case. The villagers drove a stake through Arnold's heart, releasing a loud groan from the corpse, or so they later reported, decapitated him and burned his remains, scattering the ashes over running water. But the story did not end there. Within weeks, more deaths followed. This time, those who had died were linked to Arnold, either through bloodline or contact. 14 more people perished, and so their graves too were opened. In many, the villagers claimed to find the same signs: flesh too whole, blood where there should be none. A look, they said, of unnatural peace. All were subjected to the same rituals: staking, decapitation, burning. It became not just an exhumation, but an epidemic. News of the panic and the mass grave rituals reached the attention of Austrian military authorities. A report was requested. Investigators were dispatched. One of them, Johannes Flückinger, wrote a detailed account of the events. It was published and widely circulated, and it became one of the most influential texts in early vampire lore. He documented the timeline of deaths, the condition of each exhumed body, the rituals performed, the villagers' testimonies. He did not dismiss the claims. In fact, he seemed disturbed, but thorough. His report, filled with observations of preserved corpses and unexplained deaths, added legitimacy to the panic, and through it, the case of Arnold Paole became one of the most famous vampire cases in recorded history. The story of Arnold Paole is important not only because of its eerie details, but because of what it tells us. It tells us how fear moves, from memory to imagination, from belief to ritual. It shows how tradition and trauma entwine, especially in times of crisis. It reveals a society grappling with death in the only way it knew how, by giving it a name and a face. Arnold Paole was not a monster. He was a man, a soldier, a casualty of superstition. And yet his name lives on, not for the life he lived, but for the terror his death inspired. So now, we let him rest, as perhaps he was never allowed to in life. We cover his grave with earth again, softly, and whisper blessings over the ashes of fear. But the panic did not stop. It spread. Next, we'll see how the stories of Peter and Arnold leapt across borders, reaching new lands and new imaginations. Let us continue, quietly, along the path of this spreading shadow. From the valleys of Serbia, the fear travelled like wind over mountaintops, whispered across borders, and rooted itself in the hearts of neighbouring lands. Because the fear of vampires was never contained by earth or language. It travelled in stories, and it grew. After the cases of Peter Plogojowitz and Arnold Paole, a ripple moved through Eastern Europe. At first, a tremor, then a wave. The lands we now call Hungary and Romania, rich in folklore, touched by war and plague, wrapped in forests and hills, became fertile ground for this ancient fear to take hold. They were not strangers to the idea of the undead. These cultures already had their own words, their own warnings, and now vampire panic spread into them not as a foreign idea, but as a recognisable echo. In the early 18th century, Hungary was part of the Habsburg Empire, its borders overlapping with modern-day Slovakia, Romania, and parts of Serbia. The Carpathian Mountains, winding, mist-covered, formed a natural boundary, but not a spiritual one. On the other side, Wallachia and Transylvania, regions in what we now call Romania, were semi-autonomous, shaped by local rule and the slow retreat of Ottoman control. These were places of transition, between East and West, between empire and resistance, between old beliefs and newer, stricter Christian doctrine, and where boundaries blurred, myths found space to grow. Each region had its own term for what we call the vampire. In Hungarian tradition, it was the vampire, borrowed from Slavic neighbours, but quickly folded into local fears. In Romania, the undead were known as strigoi, spirits of the dead that rose from the grave to torment the living, often associated with restlessness in the afterlife or improper burial. Moroi, sometimes considered the offspring of a vampire and a human, or living children cursed with the thirst for life essence. These figures weren't always evil, but they were always unnatural. And so, when the reports from Serbia reached these regions, of graves disturbed, corpses bloated and red-lipped, it resonated immediately. The villagers recognised what was happening, and they acted. In Hungary, small towns began reporting clusters of deaths, just like in Kisilova and Medwena. And just like before, the solution was the same. Graves were opened, corpses examined for signs, rituals performed, stakes, decapitations, burnings. By the 1730s, this panic had reached such intensity that state authorities, including Austrian military and medical officials, began documenting the events in detail. In some towns, mass exhumations were performed. Entire cemeteries turned to upheaval, not out of malice, but of protection. Because fear is a powerful motivator, and belief, when shared, becomes action. In Wallachia and Transylvania, the response took on deeper ritual form. Here, ancient beliefs ran parallel to Christianity, not in opposition but in fusion. Villagers might place a needle in the corpse's heart so the soul would stay put, insert a coin beneath the tongue, a toll for safe passage to the afterlife, tie the body with red thread or wrap it in garlic-stuffed linen, perform funeral vigils for multiple nights, lighting candles, whispering prayers, and watching for signs of unrest. In especially feared cases, the corpse's heart was removed and burned, its ashes sometimes mixed with water and given to survivors to drink as protection. To modern minds, this may sound unthinkable, but to them, It was medicine, the only kind they knew. In the Romanian countryside, families sometimes appointed vigil keepers, those who would stay near the graveyard during dangerous nights. They would watch for disturbances, fresh soil where none should be, animal footprints circling a plot, unusual howls or bird cries at dusk. These watchers weren't armed. They weren't hunters. They were witnesses. If they saw something, they would call for the elders. The circle would form, and the grave would open. As vampire hysteria passed from Serbia into Hungary and Romania, something remarkable happened. For the first time in recorded history, multiple cultures began speaking the same fear, in different tongues but with the same gestures. Watch the graves, mind the signs, protect the living. The vampire ceased to be a local ghost. It became a regional figure with recognizable habits, weaknesses, and threats. And through stories shared at borders, through letters and reports and whispered tales, a pan-European vampire was taking shape. But as this shared fear grew louder, so too did the questions. How could a dead body stay so fresh? Why did some decay faster than others? Were these rituals truly stopping evil? Or were they misunderstanding nature? The answers would begin to form, not from superstition, but from science, and that's where we turn next. Not to graves or ghosts, but to glass jars, anatomy books, and the flickering light of enlightenment. Let us now step softly from the graveyard to the study, from the flicker of torchlight to the steady glow of candlelight against parchment, from rituals whispered under moonlight to quiet observations written in ink. Because even the deepest fears can be unmade, not by fire or stake, but by understanding. By the mid-18th century, the winds of change were beginning to stir across Europe, not only on battlefields or through royal courts, but in the pages of books, the halls of universities, and the curious minds of physicians and philosophers. The Enlightenment had begun, and with it came a slow, careful unravelling of superstition. The vampire, once unquestioned, once feared as a very real predator of the night, was now becoming a medical puzzle, a subject of debate, not dread. Let us now follow the scholars who looked into the grave and saw not a monster, but a misunderstood corpse. During the Enlightenment, intellectuals across Europe began to challenge long-held beliefs, not through force, but through inquiry. They questioned, what happens to the body after death? Why do some corpses appear bloated? What causes blood to appear at the mouth of the deceased? Could illness, not the undead, explain clusters of mysterious deaths? To answer these, they turned not to priests or hunters, but to doctors, anatomists, natural philosophers. These men, many of whom had studied in Vienna, Paris, or Berlin, began to collect reports of vampire cases, not to endorse them, but to investigate them. And slowly they found patterns. One of the most important realizations came from a simple, gruesome truth. The human body does not decay the same way in all environments. In colder climates, decomposition is slower. In sealed graves, gases build up. In some cases, these gases cause swelling of the abdomen, making the body appear well-fed or bloated, purge fluid, a dark, blood-like substance, to leak from the mouth and nose, pressure to build in the lungs, sometimes causing groaning sounds when disturbed. To an untrained eye, these were unmistakable signs of life. But to the growing scientific community, they were signs of natural decay. The vampire's bloody mouth, merely fluids escaping, its rosy cheeks, post-mortem discoloration, the appearance of hair and nail growth, a drying of skin that exposed what was already there. The monster, they argued, was not rising from the grave. It had never risen at all. By the 1750s, the vampire panic had drawn enough attention that major voices began to publicly intervene. One of the most notable was Gerhard van Swieten, a physician to the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Disturbed by the vampire exhumations happening in the Habsburg territories, where villagers were still performing post-mortem rituals, he conducted his own investigation. His conclusion was direct. Vampires do not exist. What has been taken for signs of life are the natural processes of death. These superstitions must be stopped. Under his advice, the Empress issued decrees restricting vampire trials, grave openings, and ritual burnings. Slowly the panic began to subside, not because fear vanished, but because authority shifted, from legend to science. Yet this transition was not immediate, not smooth. In many rural areas, local traditions continued, often in secret. Even when officials prohibited exhumations, graves were still disturbed, quietly at night, by those unwilling to risk another outbreak of death. Villagers still placed garlic in doorways, still buried their dead with coins or stakes, just in case, because belief is not so easily undone by paper and law. But it began to fade. As literacy rose and as more people had access to education, the vampire slipped further into metaphor, and further from fact. As science unravelled the physical reality of the vampire, a new form of the creature emerged, not in graves, but in books. Writers began to explore the emotional truth behind the vampire legend. Why were people so afraid of death returning? What did the vampire represent? By the late 1700s, the vampire had begun its slow migration into Gothic fiction. A creature of mood, of mystery, of desire and darkness. But that was the beginning of a different tale. Here, in the quiet graveyards of Hungary and Serbia, the vampire's flesh and blood reign was coming to an end. Not with fire, not with fear, but with understanding. So let us close the anatomy book, extinguish the candle on the scholar's desk, and leave behind the whispering of worms and the scribbling of ink. The vampire of superstition had begun to fade, but something else remained. A memory, a myth, a legacy, and that is where we go next. Let us now turn the page to another kind of influence. Not the rituals of villagers or the insights of physicians, but the printed word. Because long before screens glowed and voices came from speakers, there was the crackling rhythm of ink against parchment, a press pulled down, a sheet lifted, and a headline that would send fear cascading across a continent. In the 18th century, the printing press was becoming more accessible, and with it came the earliest forms of mass communication. Newspapers were small, often just a few pages, but they were powerful. They travelled by horseback and ship, were read aloud in taverns, pasted on walls, and carried between cities in travellers' pockets, and among stories of grain prices, royal decrees and weather, there began to appear, now and then, a most unsettling headline. A vampire in Serbia. Corpses feed upon the living. Dead man returns, villagers in panic. And so the myth grew not only in graveyards, but in columns. Before newspapers, stories of vampires were shared by word of mouth, passed from neighbour to neighbour, village to village, told by firelight in hushed tones. But once the press got involved, those same tales became official, stamped in ink, preserved in archive, given a sense of legitimacy they never had before. Suddenly, what might have been dismissed as folklore felt real, especially when the accounts included names of the deceased, dates and places of exhumation, descriptions of the body's condition, and sometimes even statements from officials or priests. People who had never stepped foot in the Balkans now believed in vampires because they had read about them. The language of these early articles was often breathless. They described corpses with blood dripping from their lips, villagers who fell ill after being bitten, graves that trembled in the night, rituals where the stake caused the dead to groan. To a reader in Paris or London or Vienna, these accounts were as horrifying as they were exotic. And the more sensational the report, the more copies it sold. Editors quickly learned fear was good for business. One of the most circulated reports was the case of Arnold Paole. When Johannes Flückinger's account was published in 1732, it was not printed just once, but translated and reprinted across Europe. It appeared in German, French, and English newspapers. Each version varied slightly, emphasizing different elements: the bloated corpse, the priest's involvement, the ritual destruction. This helped cement the idea that vampirism was a widespread phenomenon, not a quirk of a single village, but a growing epidemic. And as readers devoured these stories over morning coffee or supper, they didn't just read about fear, they felt it. As these reports multiplied, a pattern began to emerge. The vampire, once seen as a literal threat, became something more, a symbol, in regions suffering from famine, plague, war, or political instability. The vampire became a stand-in for all that was feared but not understood. The newspaper stories didn't just spread panic, they spread interpretation. the idea that there were hidden forces draining life, not just from individuals, but from entire communities. Though the vampire panic eventually subsided, the press had already done its work. By the end of the 18th century, the vampire was no longer confined to remote Balkan villages. It now lived in the imagination of Europe. It became a figure of superstition, disease, nightmares, and eventually, of fiction. But the seed had been planted by fact, or what seemed like fact. A body in a grave, a headline, a fear shared across borders. And so we leave the printing press behind. The metal type, the fresh ink, the quiet crackle of paper, the vampire once whispered about in fields and forests had now become an international legend, thanks to the power of the printed word. But what deeper truths lay beneath that fear? Let us step into the next chapter, where we will look not at corpses or articles but at the culture itself, and ask, what was the vampire panic truly about? Let us now slow our breath and walk even deeper, beneath the headlines, beyond the graves, past the rituals and the press clippings, into the heart of what it all meant. Because sometimes, fear is not just about what we see, but what we cannot name. In the cold soil of Eastern Europe, the vampire once stirred. But in truth, it was not merely the dead that rose. It was grief. It was doubt. It was a culture wrestling with its own reflection, in a time when answers were scarce and death never far. The vampire panic was not just a flurry of strange events. It was a crisis of meaning, woven from centuries of tradition, trauma, and belief. Let us now explore what lay beneath it all, what the vampire stood for when the world no longer made sense. The 18th century was a time of dramatic change. The Ottoman Empire was slowly retreating from the Balkans. The Habsburgs were asserting imperial control. Borders shifted, faith collided with modernity. Rural communities, long governed by custom and kinship, now faced foreign rule, new laws, and unfamiliar faces. It was a time of uncertainty, and in such times, people cling to the familiar, to stories, to symbols, to rituals that explain suffering. And what is more familiar than the fear of death? The vampire emerged from this atmosphere not just as a creature, but as a reflection of every anxiety people carried. One of the most painful realities of life in these regions was how often death came without explanation. Plague, cholera, malaria, consumption, diseases with no known cure, striking without warning. Children lost overnight, young brides buried days after their wedding, villages silenced by fever, and when one death followed another, in the same house or the same street, the survivors asked, why? Science had no answer. The church offered comfort, but not certainty. But folklore provided action. The vampire offered an explanation, a known enemy, a name to give the chaos, a body to dig up, a ritual to perform. The vampire was not just feared, it was deeply familiar. In many Balkan traditions, the idea of the dead lingering was woven into older beliefs. Ancestors were honoured but also appeased. Spirits were welcomed, but also feared. The boundary between life and death was thin and often porous. In this worldview, death was not a clean break. It was a process, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes dangerous. And so, the vampire became a symbol of what happens when that process fails. A soul that refuses to leave, a death that won't complete itself. In this way, the panic was not just fear of evil, but fear of imbalance, of the unnatural, the unsettled. In the face of these fears, communities turned to what they had always known: ritual. Rituals are not only acts of belief, they are acts of control. When a grave was opened, when a stake was driven, when prayers were whispered over ash and fire. It wasn't just to stop a vampire, it was to restore order, to say, we know how to fight this, we are not helpless. In that sense, the vampire panic was a kind of collective therapy, a way to grieve together, to act together, to heal. However grim it may seem to us now, it was at the time a necessary ritual of resilience. The vampire also represented something deeper, a fear of the other. This other was not always foreign. Sometimes it was the deviant, the one who broke social rules, the outsider, the strange. It could be the old woman who lived alone, the traveller who passed through at dusk, the soldier who came back changed, the child who never cried. anyone who didn't fit, anyone whose death seemed wrong. In naming them vampire, the community was also defining themselves, who belonged, who didn't, what death should look like, and when it didn't, fear rushed in. Above all, the vampire panic was a meditation on one enduring question. What happens when the dead do not stay dead? It is a fear older than ink, older than blood, older than myth. In many ways, the vampire is not a monster at all. It is a question. One whispered at midnight, "Is it truly over when the breath leaves the body?" The villagers of the Balkans, the readers in Vienna, the priests, the hunters, the mourners, they were all asking this again and again, and the vampire was their answer. So now, with this understanding, let us step back, not away from the story, but deeper into it. Because the vampire, as we've seen, was never just about death. It was about us, our fears, our boundaries, our longing to explain the inexplicable, and though science would later dispel the myth and fiction would reimagine it, the truth of that fear, quiet, cold, communal, remains, and in our next chapter we will see how science rose to meet that fear, not to erase it, but to reinterpret it. Let us now walk carefully, away from shadowed rituals and trembling graveyards, and into the cool, lamplit chambers of medicine, where men with steady hands and ink-stained fingers began to study what others had feared, because the vampire, once a symbol of mystery, was becoming a subject of analysis, and though belief fades slowly, understanding was rising. As Enlightenment thought began to take root across Europe, a new kind of curiosity emerged, one that asked not who cursed the village, but what illness moved through its streets. This shift did not come overnight. It unfolded slowly, like a scroll, as physicians, naturalists and scholars began to peel back the veil of folklore. What they found beneath was not a monster, but misunderstood biology, untreated disease, and the ancient ache of human fear. Let us now open that book and read what science had to say. For centuries, villagers who exhumed the dead were shocked by what they found. They expected skeletal remains, but often encountered corpses that seemed disturbingly intact. Bloated stomachs, ruddy skin, blood at the mouth or nose, hair and fingernails that seemed to have grown, these were interpreted as signs of continued life. But science would later explain them otherwise. When a body decomposes, especially in cold or airless graves, gases produced by internal bacteria cause the abdomen to swell. This bloat gives the illusion of a body feeding or growing. Skin retracts as it dries, exposing hair shafts and nail beds, creating the illusion of post-mortem growth. The blood at the mouth, a dark fluid called purge, leaking from the lungs or stomach due to pressure. Groans heard during staking, a simple release of gas from a punctured chest cavity. What once seemed supernatural was simply unknown physiology. In communities struck by death, especially when entire families fell ill, it was natural to seek a cause. One body dies, another follows, and soon the village whispers, "Something is coming for us." But science revealed that the true culprit was often infection. Diseases like tuberculosis, also known as consumption, were particularly feared. Its symptoms included weight loss, pale skin, coughing blood, weakness that deepened over time. To the people of the time, it looked as though life was being drained away. Some even believed that the dead were feeding on the living, especially if a family member fell sick after another had died. But now we know they were likely sharing the same disease, spread by close contact and misread as a curse. In truth, it wasn't the dead who infected the living, but the living who shared in a common fate. Of all illnesses, tuberculosis most closely resembled vampiric attack, a slow wasting of the body, a haunting pallor, the eerie red stain of blood at the lips. In 19th century New England, long after the European vampire panic had faded, cases of tuberculosis sparked a renewed vampire panic, this time in America. Families desperate to stop the spread exhumed their loved ones. They looked for signs of freshness, burned hearts, mixed ashes with water as a cure. They didn't call it disease, they called it vampirism. Even across the Atlantic in the land of modernity, the old fears lingered, and they looked a lot like science that hadn't yet arrived. We return again to Gerhard van Swieten, court physician to Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. In 1755, alarmed by the reports of vampire hysteria across her territories, the Empress commissioned Van Swieten to investigate. He concluded that all signs of vampirism were the result of natural decomposition and psychological suggestion. His report, titled Abhandlung des Dasein der Gespenster, Discourse on the Existence of Ghosts, was widely circulated. It dismissed all belief in vampires as superstition and recommended strict bans on grave exhumations and staking rituals. Maria Theresa agreed. By 1756, imperial policy began to restrict vampire-related practices, shifting the focus from folk response to medical explanation. And slowly, very slowly, the panic began to fade. Enlightenment thinkers did not simply scoff at superstition. They studied it, tried to understand its roots, and sought to replace fear with knowledge. In doing so, they also made room for compassion. They recognized the pain behind the panic. They saw that communities weren't cruel, but desperate. That rituals were not madness, but medicine, in a time without better cures. The scientific explanations did not erase the stories, but they changed them. The vampire was no longer a thing to be hunted. It was a lesson in misunderstanding, in the high cost of ignorance, and the quiet, noble power of reason. And so we close the physician's notebook. We leave the flicker of candlelight on the dissecting table, the ink-dried pages of observation, and return, briefly, to the world of symbols. Because even as the panic faded, the vampire remained, no longer in the grave, but in the imagination. And that imagination would soon give rise to something new, a legend reborn. Let us gently turn the page forward in time, from the era of fervent fear and frantic rituals to a quieter age where reason and reflection slowly eased the shadows. Because even the deepest fears, when met with understanding, begin to soften, to fade, like twilight yielding to the calm of night. As the 18th century moved steadily onward, the grip of vampire panic loosened. This was no sudden awakening, no abrupt end, but a gradual, patient unwinding. The world was changing. The once shadowy borders of superstition were illuminated by the soft light of science, reason, and law. Let us now walk through this delicate transition, tracing how a centuries-old terror quietly receded into the folds of history. The Enlightenment, that great movement of intellectual inquiry, emphasized observation, experimentation, and skepticism. These ideals began to permeate even remote villages, carried by travelers, teachers, and new books. With increased literacy and education, people began to question traditional beliefs. The supernatural explanations for disease and death gave way to medical diagnoses, natural causes, understanding of the human body and its processes. And with this came a growing awareness. The dead did not rise to prey upon the living. The vampires of folklore were stories, not reality. Aware of the disturbances caused by vampire panics, grave openings, ritual killings, and social unrest, governments took steps to curb the hysteria. In the Habsburg Empire, authorities issued decrees forbidding exhumations without permission. Officials intervened when rumours of vampirism spread, seeking to maintain order. Church leaders also increasingly discouraged the practice of staking and burning suspected vampires, emphasizing faith over superstition. These combined measures reduced the frequency of vampire hunts and gradually brought an end to widespread panic. Advances in medicine played a crucial role. Doctors explained diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and plague in terms of contagion and pathology. The symptoms once attributed to vampire attacks, wasting bodies, coughing blood, sudden deaths, were now understood as the natural progression of illness. Public health measures slowly improved, reducing the devastating outbreaks that had fueled fear. Though progress was uneven, the narrative shifted from supernatural to medical. As Eastern Europe grew more integrated with Western ideas, superstitions began to be seen as relics of a darker past. Younger generations, exposed to education and new ideas, questioned the validity of vampire lore. Folklore became stories told by elders, rather than guides for action. Vampires retreated from the realm of danger into the realm of storytelling, legends to share by firelight, rather than threats to face. However, the decline was not absolute nor immediate. In many rural areas, belief in vampires lingered well into the 19th century. Families still performed protective rituals. Tales of revenants and restless spirits remained part of local culture. But these beliefs existed alongside and increasingly overshadowed by modern explanations. As fear waned, fascination grew. The vampire transformed from an object of terror into a subject of curiosity. Travellers and scholars collected tales documenting them as cultural artifacts. The vampire became a symbol of death, desire, otherness. This shift laid the groundwork for the vampire's enduring place in art, literature, and popular imagination. So as twilight turns to night, the vampire panic of the 18th century gently folds into history. No longer a panic, but a story, a caution, a metaphor, a whisper in the dark. And with that, we prepare to step forward into the world shaped by these stories, where the vampire would live on, not in the graveyards of Eastern Europe, but in the pages of books and the dreams of generations. Let us now leave behind the fading shadows of superstition and step gently into the glow of imagination, where the vampire transforms from feared revenant to timeless legend. Because while the panic of old may have passed, the story, the myth, lives on. As the 18th century vampire panic receded into history, its echoes did not vanish. Instead, they grew, mingling with new stories, new fears, and new desires. The vampire, once a literal threat to life, became a powerful symbol of mystery, of immortality, and of the shadowy edge between life and death. Let us now trace the long, winding path from grim village graves to the glittering pages of modern Gothic tales. In the decades following the decline of vampire hysteria, Europe saw a blossoming of Gothic literature, a genre rich with dark, brooding atmospheres and tales of the supernatural. Writers began to take the vampire myth and reshape it, transforming it into a figure of allure, tragedy, and profound mystery. Early works, like John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, and later Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, borrowed heavily from the folklore and panics of Eastern Europe. These stories introduced new traits: the seductive charm, the eternal loneliness, the struggle between human and monster. The vampire was no longer simply a creature of death, but a mirror reflecting human fears and desires. Many iconic vampire features have roots in 18th century panics and beliefs. The stake through the heart, decapitation, the fear of sunlight, the association with blood, all are echoes of the desperate rituals and fears of the Balkans. Even the concept of the vampire rising from a sealed grave or returning to prey upon family and neighbours harkens back to those very first cases, like Peter Plogojowitz and Arnold Paole. Modern vampire mythology continues to explore themes first born in that dark time: the fear of death and the unknown, the tension between life and immortality, the outsider or other, desire, power, and seduction. Vampires have become metaphors for everything from social alienation to forbidden passion. They haunt the pages of books, the frames of films, and the pixels of video games, a testament to the enduring power of myth. What began as a series of frightened responses to death and disease has grown into one of the most recognizable and adaptable myths in the world. From the isolated villages of 18th century Serbia to the grand stages of Victorian England to the modern-day screen, the vampire continues to evolve. Its ability to reflect our deepest anxieties and desires keeps it alive, far beyond the grave. Even now, centuries later, we find ourselves drawn to vampire stories. There is comfort in the ritual, wonder in the mystery, and perhaps a quiet understanding that the vampire is not just about fear, but about the human condition itself. Because the vampire story asks us, what does it mean to live, to die, to be remembered? And in that question, there is something deeply, beautifully timeless. So as our journey nears its end, let us take a moment to reflect on the long shadow cast by the vampire panic, a shadow that reached beyond fear, beyond superstition, and into the heart of storytelling itself. And as you lay down to rest, know that these tales, these fears, these legends are part of the very fabric of our shared history, whispering softly in the dark. Let us now gently draw the curtains on our journey, softly, calmly, with a soothing reflection. For the story of vampires is more than a tale of fear. It is a window into humanity itself. As night deepens and your breath slows, consider the power of stories, how they grow from whispers and shadows, from grief and hope, and the timeless dance between the known and the unknown. The vampire panic of the 18th century was born of real fears, of death, disease, and uncertainty. It was a way for people to grasp at meaning when the world seemed dark and unyielding. Why do these legends persist across centuries and cultures? Perhaps because they speak to a universal truth, that we all grapple with mortality, with what lies beyond the final breath, with the fear that something might linger, unseen, in the spaces between life and death. Vampires embody those fears, and also our fascination with them. They are the undead mirrors we hold up to ourselves. At their core, vampire myths explore the human psyche. The tension between life and death, love and loss, fear and desire, the self and the other. They remind us that what terrifies us often holds the deepest truths. The vampire panic reflects how cultures process trauma, through ritual, myth, and storytelling. It shows us that even in fear there is community, even in darkness there is understanding, even in death there is narrative. So as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts quiet, let these stories settle softly in your mind, like a whispered lullaby from centuries past. Know that history's shadows, though sometimes dark, are part of the light that guides us forward, and that you too are part of this vast tapestry of stories, fears, and dreams that connect us all across time and space. May your rest be deep and peaceful, carried on the calm breath of history's gentle embrace. Thank you for joining Sleepy Shadows tonight. If you found comfort or curiosity in this tale, please share where you listened, under quiet skies, beside warm fires, or in the soft hush of your own bed. Subscribe for more journeys through history's mysteries, and may your dreams be as rich and endless as the stories we tell. Good night and sleep well.